chair, and first director of the Congressional Budget Office. Afterwards, part of this weekend's Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Bertrand Patinat, research fellow at the Hoover Institution, recounts the life of Red Army Chief Leon Trotsky. Kepler's Books in Menlo Park, California, hosts this 50-minute event.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. And let me just say, great to be here at my local bookstore, Kepler's. This evening, I'm going to highlight two things. Most speakers get up and say they're going to talk about three things, they're going to make 3 points. I'm not that ambitious. Just two things I'm going to talk about. And in fact, these are two myths that die hard about Trotsky and his last years in Mexico. The first has to do with Trotsky's affair with Frida Kahlo. Most of you have heard about this. If you haven't read about it, maybe you saw the movie. I think it was 2004, the movie Frida, which dwelled on this. The myth that dies hard is not that the affair took place, because of course it did, and I describe the circumstances in my book. In fact, the myth is that Frida's husband, Diego Rivera, later found out about it, and that this led him to break off his relationship with Trotsky. That's a myth. That's the first one. The second myth has to do with a certain ice pick. And I should say, spoiler alert, Trotsky does not do well at the end of this book. The book focuses, as Megan said, on the last years of Trotsky's life in Mexico, so 1937 to 1940. With flashbacks, though, to pivotal moments in his earlier career as young revolutionary, great orator of the Russian Revolution of 1917, creator and leader of the Red Army, and then, of course, vanquished rival of Stalin. But let's start with Diego. It was thanks to Diego Rivera, the great mural painter, that Trotsky landed in Mexico. Stalin had routed Trotsky in the battle to succeed Lenin, who died in 1924, and then sent Trotsky into exile. He actually first went to Turkey. From there, from Turkey, Trotsky eventually moved to France in 1933, then to Norway in 1935, until the political pressure on the Norwegian government forced it to expel Trotsky. Now, what do I mean by political pressure? The first of the famous Moscow show trials took place in August of 1936. Leading Bolsheviks, or I should say leading communists, were put on trial for the most fantastic crimes, including assassination of Stalin himself, attempted assassination anyway, espionage, and so on. Trotsky was portrayed as the mastermind of a group of spies, wreckers, and saboteurs directing their operations from abroad. That trial, the Moscow show trial of August 1936, was the first of 3 such show trials, each one involving major political figures, each time with Trotsky serving as the chief defendant in absentia. So, with Norway wanting to be rid of Trotsky, the only country in the world that would take him was Mexico, thanks to its radical president, Lázaro Cárdenas, who thought it was the right thing to do, but also, crucially, thanks to the intercession of Diego Rivera, who called himself a Trotskyist. I say called himself advisedly, more on that in a moment, and certainly was hated by the Mexican communists. The decision by Mexico to grant asylum was controversial within Mexico, but nonetheless it happened, and Trotsky and wife Natalia arrived there in January of 1937. Diego and Frida allowed Trotsky and Natalia to reside in their blue house, the Casa Azul, in Coyoacán, then a suburb outside Mexico City. Now, of course, it has been incorporated into the city. Rivera was a vital source of funds for Trotsky in these first 2 years, selling off his paintings, and at one point even mortgaging his house in nearby San Angel in order to help raise money for Trotsky for two things. One, to support the household, just putting food on the table, but also, and of increasing importance, money for Trotsky's protection, to pay for guards, to pay for weapons, and so on. Diego and Frida were at Trotsky's side during the Dewey Commission hearings held at the Blue House in the spring of 1937, the Dewey Commission being the independent inquiry into the veracity of the Moscow trials, led by the American philosopher and public intellectual John Dewey. The Dewey Commission eventually, by the end of 1937, issued a verdict of not guilty. In other words, that the outrageous charges against Trotsky in Moscow had not been proved. It was after the departure of the Dewey Commission, in the spring of 1937, that Trotsky and Frida began their affair. Frida's extramarital liaisons were several. I wrote numerous here, and then I crossed that out earlier and I put several, because I should point out they were nowhere near the number of her husband, who was a champion philanderer. Trotsky's relations with Frida became known to, and I talk about this at some length in the book. There's a separate chapter devoted to it about Trotsky facing old age, having this fling. The chapter title is Man of October. Trotsky's affair with Frida becomes known to Natalia. And for a while, in that summer of 1937, this threatens the Trotsky's marriage. They had a short separation that summer, exchanging letters back and forth, some with shockingly explicit sexual language on Trotsky's part. This is all true. I'm not trying to sell books. Some very, as my father-in-law put it, some naughty pages in this book. Trotsky sort of defying advancing old age, although at the time, interestingly, Trotsky feels he's getting old. He's 57. And in this day and age, we look back, 57 doesn't seem that old, certainly not from up here, it doesn't look that old. 57, but he's called the old man by his acolytes, and he very much is feeling that way at this time, beginning in the late 1930s. It was during that separation, Trotsky was staying at a hacienda about a 10-hour drive from Coyoacán. It was during that separation that Trotsky and Frida decided to call a halt. We're pretty certain about this. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that Diego found out about any of this, either at the time or later on, when the friendship between Trotsky and Diego began to disintegrate. Had Rivera discovered that Trotsky was having an affair with his wife, Trotsky, the great Russian revolutionary, Trotsky, Diego Rivera's hero, the man he had arranged safe haven for in Mexico, Diego might have ended Trotsky's life before Stalin's assassin had a chance to do so. Diego was famously jealous of Frida, just jealous generally, always threatening people with a gun in his hand. So I speculate here that had he found out, we would have heard some fireworks. Trotsky would have heard some fireworks. For now, the friendship between Trotsky and Diego remained strong. It was Diego who broke the news to Trotsky in February of 1938 that Trotsky's older son, Lyova, it's a nickname for Lev, like Lev Trotsky, Lyova had died in a Paris clinic after an operation to remove his appendix. We'll probably never know whether foul play was involved on the part of the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. Most books say, well, of course, they knocked him off. It's not clear. But what is clear is that Trotsky had to assume that this was the case. Trotsky's other children were by now all dead or had disappeared. A daughter, Nina, died of natural causes in the USSR. tuberculosis in the 1920s. Another daughter, Zina, died a suicide in Berlin in 1933. And younger son, Sergei, or Seryoja, was arrested in Moscow. That the Trotskys knew. What they did not know was that he was shot while Trotsky was in Mexico and still alive. Other family members of the Trotskys had to endure a similar fate, as did most of Trotsky's followers. This, after all, was the period of the Great Terror. Trotsky's Paris organization had been penetrated by the NKVD. In fact, son Lyova's closest confidant was an NKVD agent. So it is conceivable that Lyova's death was, in fact, murder. Beginning especially in 1938, Trotsky now had to worry about the NKVD's presence in Mexico. And the reason for this was that the Spanish Civil War was underway, had been since the summer of 1936. And Spain, in those 2 years, had become a recruiting ground for the NKVD. And as General Franco's Falangist forces rolled to victory, Mexico becomes a haven for refugees from the war. Defenders of the Republic, to be sure, but they include NKVD agents, or if not agents, certainly Stalinist sympathizers. Diego's help in building up the defenses at the Blue House and in hiring guards at this time becomes critically important. Those guards were mostly young Americans from New York, and I mean New York City, but also from Minneapolis, where the Trotskyists had actually put down roots among the Teamsters organization. It was the only place in the country where the Trotskyists really had a following among what Trotsky called the proletariat. Some of those Teamsters came to Coyoacán to serve as guards, and some less successfully than others. The Teamsters, it turns out, were not all cut out to be guards of Trotsky or anybody else. Despite Diego's generosity at this time, the shortage of funds in the Trotsky household, just to run the household, but also for his protection, is really quite shocking. One of the things I discovered in researching the book, they're always running out of money. The guard fund runs out of money. They're asking Natalia for funds. Please don't tell Trotsky, and back and forth and all around. Also, what you sort of get what you pay for. What you see is the poor quality of some of the guards. And that's quite scandalous as well. I mean, you can barely believe it, reading the documents or reading the book, that this is the best that the great Trotsky could attract, or the most money he could attract to the till. Trotsky himself is constantly complaining about the quality of his guards, and because of this, by 1939, he's really resisting being guarded. Very important part of the story. To support himself and the household, Trotsky is writing, as he has done through the 1930s, the period of his exile. He established his reputation in the West really with his epic history of the Russian Revolution and his memoirs, My Life, both published in the early 1930s. Now, in 1938, out of desperation, Trotsky agrees to write a biography of Stalin. The publisher is Harper, the predecessor of my publisher, HarperCollins. Trotsky finds this very distasteful. He drags his feet about taking it on, but ultimately he decides that he has to do it because he needs to protect himself from Stalin's assassins. So we have a situation where Trotsky is writing the biography of the man who's trying to have him killed. Very interesting. Trotsky gets off to a fast start with the biography in 1938, but the work becomes bogged down, not surprisingly, when Trotsky reaches the part of the story where Stalin and Trotsky face off in Soviet Russia after 1917. He just can't write those chapters. He gets serious writer's block, And also, his health begins to fail. The return of a mysterious illness that plagued him at critical moments in the struggle for power in the 1920s, lethargy, high blood pressure, extremely high blood pressure, loss of appetite, not the fever. The fever that characterized his illness in the 1920s does not return. This entire situation, the pressure for funds, the health concerns, publisher and literary agent on his back, that's the worst of it, becomes actually worse in the fall of 1938 when the friendship between Trotsky and Diego begins to fracture. Now, this has nothing to do with Frida Kahlo, who was away in New York and then in Paris exhibiting her work. This is the time when Frida really comes into her own as an artist. She had been in her husband's shadow up till this time. Later, by the way, she would credit Trotsky's presence in Mexico for really having her career take off, inspiration to paint, and so on. So Frida's away. So what explains the break? Really, the friendship between Trotsky and Diego seems from the beginning destined to go sour. You have, on the one hand, Trotsky, rigid, prickly, angular, and on the other, Diego, reckless, riotous, gargantuan, the lion and the elephant. Diego bathed irregularly, dressed carelessly, seldom arrived on time for anything. Trotsky, meanwhile, was a stickler for neatness, regimen, and routine. Both men had tremendous work ethics, but Diego's self-discipline was restricted almost entirely to his painting, and with brush in hand, he tended to lose track of nearly everything else. On the Day of the Dead, November 2, today, in 1938, Diego walked into Trotsky's study at the Blue House and presented him with a sugar skull, not an unusual thing to do on Day of the Dead. This sugar skull had the name Stalin spelled out across the forehead. Trotsky was not amused, and as soon as Diego had left the house, he ordered his assistant to have the offending object destroyed. A year ago, I speculate, Trotsky might have let that go, but at this point he had really become sort of fed up. It all was unraveling, and the split came that winter when Diego went off the rails politically in advance of Mexico's presidential elections. They won't take place till the summer of 1940, but there's a long run-up. Cardenas cannot run again, and so there's a real struggle for power. Diego was not a Trotskyist, it turns out, and even his Marxism is open to question. Diego was a free spirit. If anything, he was a populist. Given Diego's very public political freelancing, Trotsky called it zigzagging. Trotsky felt he had no choice but to move out of the Blue House. And a new villa was found a few blocks away, and Trotsky moved in May 1939. Trotsky and Diego would never meet again. At this point in the story, another of the big three Mexican muralists, David Alfaro Siqueiros, enters the story. Trotsky had had a brief and very stimulating meeting with the other great Mexican muralist, José Clemente Orozco. They met in Guadalajara, summer of 1938, an encounter I describe in the book, quite magical, only a few hours, but Trotsky was instantly in love with Orozco, infatuated with him. Siqueiros was the late starter of the three great muralists, partly because he was so heavily into communist politics. He took it very seriously. He wasn't a dilettante like Diego. Orozco wanted nothing to do with not only communist politics, but anybody's politics by the 1930s. In fact, Siqueiros, politically, was Diego's nemesis. Here, the 2004 Frida film is quite accurate. Siqueiros, it's a long, winding story, but he goes off to fight in Spain. That actually already should tell you a lot about his commitment. It is said It's very hard to determine it for sure, but it's said that Siqueiros commanded a brigade and then a division of the Republican Army in Spain, and he attained the rank of lieutenant colonel. And it was in Spain that he was likely recruited, Siqueiros was, by the NKVD. After his return to Mexico in January 1939, Siqueiros began work on one of his most important murals. It's in the stairwell of the Mexican Electricians Union. It's still there. I went to see it when I was researching the book. It's a fantastic thing. Portrait of the Bourgeoisie, it's called. It's nothing like it sounds. It's quite violent and epic. Really one of the masterpieces of the 1930s mural art. So this was a major activity for Siqueiros. However, he was also involved in a different kind of activity on the side. This one sponsored by the NKVD. He was enlisted to lead an armed commando raid on Trotsky's home. This took place in the hours before dawn, actually it was about 4 a.m., on May 24, 1940. 20 men dressed in police and military uniforms, armed with machine guns. Siqueiros had on the uniform of an army major. These men entered the grounds. How did they get in? Wasn't Trotsky well guarded? One of the American guards from New York had been recruited by the NKVD. He opened the gate. Once in place inside the courtyard, the commandos, the intruders, set themselves up outside Trotsky's bedroom, and with Trotsky's guards pinned down in their quarters by machine gun fire, these intruders unleashed a barrage of machine gun fire into the Trotsky's bedroom from 3 directions, rooms on either side and the outside window. They also carried with them 3 homemade bombs, only one of which went off in a room adjacent to the bedroom. Clearly they were trying to set the place on fire. They left after 15 minutes, believing they had done the job. Trotsky must be dead. In fact, they had failed. Trotsky and Natalia were unhurt. They had ducked down in a corner of the room, and they survived. Trotsky's comrades called this the miraculous escape, and that's the title of the prologue to the book, because I begin with this attack, dramatic attack on May 24, 1940. Now comes the frantic preparations for the next attack. And the anticipation is that it will be with bombs. The villa must be transformed into a fortress. Turrets must be constructed atop the high walls. Double iron doors must replace the wooden entrance to the garage. Steel shutters must cover the windows. Bomb-proof wire netting must be raised, and barbed wire barriers must be moved into position. But even as those fortifications began to rise up, the NKVD had decided to resort to its fallback plan. The assignment of liquidating Trotsky, and the orders come directly from the Kremlin, from Stalin. That assignment would be entrusted to a lone operative who had managed to penetrate Trotsky's inner circle. He was Ramon Mercader, a Spaniard recruited by the NKVD in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. In Paris, in the summer of 1938, disguised as a Belgian student using the alias Jacques Monard, he seduced the sister of one of Trotsky's former secretaries, former assistants. She was a Brooklyn Trotskyist. She was visiting Paris by the name of Sylvia Agiloff. Mercader Monard arrived in New York in the fall of 1939, now using the name Frank Jackson, or Jackson, a Canadian businessman. That was his new identity. Sylvia knew about this as a front and decided to go along with it for her own reasons. She had no idea what he was up to and had no idea that he belonged to the NKVD. He maneuvered Sylvia down to Mexico City, and he used her to insinuate himself into Trotsky's household. He claimed to be a heavy financial supporter of the French Trotskyists back in Paris. And of course, by the summer of 1940, there's no way to verify this, right? There's no way to contact the French Trotskyists because they're on the run from the invading Germans. The outbreak of the World War, which really starts or is made possible by the Nazi-Soviet Pact of August 1939, struck a big blow against Trotsky and his followers in New York City. New York City being at this time the center of the international Trotskyist movement. Certainly wasn't Paris at this point. Although I say the center of the movement, this is something else that's quite shocking, the total number of Trotskyists in the U.S. was probably never more than 2,000 paid, members. When the war broke out, Trotsky insisted that his followers support the Soviet Union, despite the fact that the Stalin regime had wiped out his family and his comrades, and of course was trying to have Trotsky killed. Trotsky tried to justify the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland as a result of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the Baltics, the invasion of Finland in the Winter War of 1939-40, which gave the Red Army a bloody nose, so to speak. Trotsky said, "We may not like it, but the Red Army is in fact spreading socialism to these lands." The fact is, in the Soviet Union, we have a worker state. It's a degenerated worker state, Trotsky called it, but nonetheless, the state, there is state ownership of the means of production, and so the occupied territories are getting socialism at the end of a bayonet, so to speak, with the Red Army bringing it in from the Soviet Union. This is very curious because at this very time, Trotsky was saying worker state, degenerated worker state, but at the same time, Trotsky was very openly calling the Stalinist regime totalitarian. And what's the other totalitarian regime? Nazi Germany. So for his followers in New York, primarily now, there's a lot of confusion. They just can't follow the old man, not all of them, on this line. And Trotsky is insistent, and this is taking up all his time. The biography of Stalin, that's on hold. The World War really, and what to do, what position to take on the Soviet Union and on the invasion of Finland and so on, that really is center stage now. The debates among the American Trotskyists leads to a split. The party is small enough, but there's sort of a rule of these parties on the left that if they're really small, they ought to split and become smaller, right? And this is what happens now. There is a majority. Those of you who know your Russian history, read Bolsheviks into this, because that's how Trotsky oftentimes referred to these two groups. The majority, capital M, supporting Trotsky, although really shakily at times, especially after Finland, which begins in December 1939 and which leads to the expulsion of the Soviet Union from the League of Nations. The minority, capital M, want to condemn Soviet military aggression outright and deny that the USSR was a worker state of any kind. And they were very angry with not only Trotsky's position, but the way he argued it, basically comparing the minority to the old Mensheviks, calling them petty bourgeois complainers, and so on. And when they got mad about that, calling them enraged petty bourgeois, which really got them mad, Sylvia Agaloff, the Brooklyn Trotskyist, who's the cat's paw in the story, took the side of the minority. And when she got to Mexico City, she was invited to debate, come to Trotsky's house and debate with Trotsky and the guards in Trotsky's study in Coyoacán. This is where Ramon Mercader saw his opening. He posed as a supporter of Trotsky and the majority. He wrote, he knew very little about politics, and he was very awkward about it, and it should have been clear, and it was clear, to everyone around Trotsky, but nonetheless, they went along with this. Mercader wrote a draft of an article defending the majority position, and he had it ready in August 1940, and he asked Trotsky to read it. He maneuvered to be alone with Trotsky, just the two of them, in the late afternoon of August 20, as the guards were busy installing a new siren that had just been received from the comrades in Los Angeles. Mercader, whom Trotsky assumed was a Canadian businessman by the name of Frank Jackson, someone who sympathized with the cause and was a potential source of much-needed funds, Mercader entered Trotsky's study with him at about 5:30 that afternoon of August 20, carrying his trench coat. Inside the coat was a dagger, a handgun, and a pickaxe. Not an ice pick, a pickaxe. One end was pointed like an ice pick. The other was flat and wide. The handle, about a foot long, had been cut down for concealment. Trotsky and his assassin, all alone. And the rest is up to you. Thank you. If you have questions, if you would step up to the microphone, right over here, and we have a question.
This is a long walk for a question, but it's worth it because people can hear. I'm curious about Stalin's role as a young man in financing. Can you hear this? It doesn't sound as though it's on. It is.
Well, we can all hear you, I think.
That's high-tech mics. I'm curious about Stalin's role as a young man in Georgia, engaged in all of his criminal activities there, bombing oil fields and robbing banks and this and that. If he was financing Trotsky's exile or Trotsky's existence prior to the Russian Revolution.
Whether Stalin financed Trotsky's existence prior to the Russian Revolution?
Yeah, I've read in biographies that Stalin had financed Lenin prior to the revolution, and I wondered if his the money that he was generating through his nefarious activities was also supporting Trotsky.
Okay. Interesting question, and much written about it recently. There's a book, a biography called Young Stalin by Simon Sebag Montefiore that talks about this. Still controversial whether this is overdone. Stalin's role in bank robberies before the war, robbing banks in order to support Bolshevik operations, emigre operations. Without sort of wading into that quagmire, I can just tell you that Trotsky was not a Bolshevik until 1917. So not even indirectly was Trotsky funded by that. In fact, let me just say that Trotsky was an early acolyte of Lenin. But when the party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, at a Congress, the second Congress of that party in 1903, Trotsky ended up on the side of the Mensheviks. Now, if he were here, he would immediately butt in and say, but I didn't stay with them. And in fact, he broke with the Mensheviks as well. Trotsky was, talk about free spirits, I mean, Trotsky was a kind of a freelancer as well in a very serious way. But the fact is that for all those years, from 1903 right up to 1917, Trotsky was one of Lenin's most vocal critics. And all of those criticisms would come back to haunt Trotsky after Lenin dies in 1924, and Stalin and those others around Stalin who want to make sure that Trotsky doesn't succeed Lenin, they use those quotes. So in a way, Trotsky joins the Bolshevik Party in 1917. He realizes it's the only show in town. He's the great orator of the Russian Revolution. He is, in fact, the mastermind of the October coup d'etat, if you will, and not all of you will, but the coup d'etat of 1917. And so he becomes a very important Bolshevik. But Trotsky remains an outsider within the party. And he had enough in his background, enough political baggage, so that his Menshevism, quote unquote, was always being dragged out against him. And he would always say, but I didn't belong to the Mensheviks. But nonetheless, it was anti-Bolshevism. Other questions? Anybody want to step up? Here we go. We have one here. And if you would use the microphone, or we have a gentleman coming around here. Actually, you may want to just wait a moment. Here we go.
Just sort of continuing with the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky and the developments from the time of the Russian Civil War onward. But I haven't read the book sufficiently yet, or much of Trotsky's writing. By the end of his life, or when he was in exile in Mexico for these years, that better? This mic needs.
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat the question.
What opinion, if any, had Trotsky come to regarding his defeat in the internal struggle? How did he explain it to himself, and what lessons did he draw from that?
Okay, very good question. How did Trotsky explain his defeat to Stalin? How did he rationalize it? In fact, this is a central part of my book. What really bothered Trotsky was that this nobody, Stalin, defeated him. Stalin was the gray blur, famously called, in 1917 during the revolution. He wasn't one of the stars of the Bolshevik Party. And yet, Stalin pretty handily defeated Trotsky in the 1920s. We talk about the Trotsky-Stalin conflict. Really, it was no conflict. I mean, Trotsky went down very quickly, in part because Trotsky was a poor politician. Stalin was a very able politician. And also Trotsky's anti-Bolshevik past, which I told you about, and other political ideological issues were brought in. Those are the two big ones. But for Trotsky, the idea that Stalin, the Georgian, the peasant, Asiatic, Eastern guy, defeated the great Trotsky, one of the great leaders of the revolution, really obviously bugged him. And the way he explained it was by saying that Stalin was really a nobody still, but he represented a bureaucracy that had essentially taken over the Soviet organism, sort of captured it, a bureaucratic stratum, if not class, that had really hijacked the revolution. It was still a worker state, but this bureaucratic class was a parasitic entity that had to be removed. So for Trotsky, he wasn't defeated by a person. He always hated the question, how did you lose power? He hated the question. And it was asked all the time. He would meet somebody on the street randomly, and there's a scene I describe in Turkey where somebody says, oh my gosh, the great Trotsky, and the bodyguards are there, and he shakes hands. How'd you lose power? He hated it. how did you lose your wallet? And he basically had to stop and say, and he would talk your ear off, that it wasn't about Stalin the individual, it was about the impersonal forces of history. Much easier to deal with it personally if you describe it that way. Question right here.
Just on a sarcastic note, you had the Russian Revolution, and then you had the battle between Stalin and Trotsky. Mm-hmm. Stalin takes power and kills millions and millions of people, right? Okay. Was all this worth a revolution? I mean, why not just stick with the Russian aristocracy? Why did Russia go through all this? And isn't it typical of history that this type of thing happens?
Right.
Just your opinion.
Well, that's one of those big questions. I'm actually teaching a course in the Stanford History Department on modern Russia right now, and this is just the kind, I mean, this is sort of like the theme of the course, and it would take a long time to answer the question. The fact is, Trotsky always said that everything was worth it through the October Revolution and a few years beyond. And that all you had to do was to oust that parasitic regime, and you would have the restoration of democracy, of workers' democracy, and of true sort of Soviet democracy. In fact, Trotsky's problem is that he wasn't a proponent of democracy while he was in the Soviet leadership. Only when he was being defeated did he recognize the virtues of inner-party democracy, and he wasn't talking about democracy beyond that. And in fact, if you look at the first trials, these aren't the show trials, but there are trials beginning in 1928, 29, 30. A lot of people don't know about these. They're not the show trials of the major Bolshevik leaders, but of engineers, of specialists in various fields, of the Mensheviks in 1931. And for those trials, Trotsky is living abroad. He's in Turkey, and he's supporting what Stalin is doing, in fact, criticizing Stalin for not going far enough. Later, he would apologize for this. But Trotsky had a credibility problem when it came to being a quote-unquote Democrat, and that's sort of part of the larger question you're asking, which is more of a rhetorical question, but would take a long time to answer. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Has the opening up of the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet Union added additional information on your story? If not, what would be the primary sources, particularly for the NKVD part of it, right, and the Mexican side during his Mexican residence? Right.
Very good question. And the question is whether the opening up of the archives, the former Soviet archives, influenced my book, and I'll open it up generally and talk about other scholarship. The short version is that when the Soviet Union collapses and Boris Yeltsin becomes president, there is this period, not to go back and say that the Yeltsin years were idyllic, but there was this period when we had, and when I say we, I mean Western researchers as well as Russian, had a lot of access to Soviet archives, including some NKVD, KGB archives. That access really has come to an end since the ascendancy of Putin. But I benefited greatly from the access that was given in, let's say, the first 8 years of the 1990s, or the first 8 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, because what happened is when you didn't have Western scholars going into the NKVD, KGB archives, which really remained mostly closed during this period, you had Russian scholars and others. In fact, Russian agencies, the Russian successor to the KGB itself, publishing books of documents. And here I had great material come out about the plot to assassinate Trotsky, the earlier attempt, and the whole network the NKVD put together, how much money they spent on it. And right up until when I was finishing the book, there was a biography that came out. I just caught it in time to be able to use it, a biography of one of the key members of the hit squad that organized the commando raid. Wonderfully informative biography based on, again, those documents. So we can't get in, especially now, especially in the last decade, but others did. And I believe, if you believe the reviews, that my account of the Trotsky murder is the most complete that we have so far, and it's helped in part because I found some great materials here at the Hoover Institution Archives, where I did a lot of my research. Also at the Harvard Archives, where Trotsky's papers are, right? I used the exile papers. Interesting point. Trotsky's papers have been there for a very long time. In fact, he sold his papers to Harvard just before he died. And on the morning he was struck, August 20, he received a telegram saying that his papers had arrived safe at Harvard. $6,000 is what Harvard paid, all of $6,000. Quite amazing. So, but the exile papers, which means everything from 1929, when Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union, all the way up until his death, those were not open to scholars until 1980. And because of that, well, not to all scholars, Isaac Deutscher, who wrote the classic trilogy of Trotsky, The Prophet Armed, The Prophet Unarmed, The Prophet Outcast, had access to those archives. But you had to trust him. And he was not great for sources, not always. When it came to the affair with Frida, he just looked the other way. He couldn't believe it was happening. He was sort of flustered. You can't blame him. He was writing in the 1950s. But the Deutscher biography had some access to this. But the spate of biographies of Trotsky that came out in the 1970s, no one had access to the exile papers. And so people then kind of lose interest in Trotsky. And then when they regain interest in Trotsky, and it really starts with Dmitry Volkogonov, a former Soviet army general who writes these great biographies in the early 1990s and has access to the archives. When those come out, everyone is focused not on Harvard. They're focused on what you're asking about. We want to get into the archives and see what's there. So in fact, what I found as I began to research the book is that there was a lot of great stuff at Harvard. And then here, Hoover inherited the papers of the Socialist Workers' Party. That was Trotsky's party in America. And you would be surprised, because Hoover has a reputation, of course, for being a conservative think tank. But there are many people on the left who will give their papers to the Hoover archives because they know they'll be well taken care of and their researchers will have access to them and so on. Great stuff. The bodyguards, those Teamsters and others, the papers are here. So I was able to use those. And so all that taken together, I pulled together the story of the murder in a way that hadn't been done before. One more question? Yes, one more question. Come on up.
I don't really need the mic.
Okay, I'll repeat it.
Trotskyist and Trotsky. All my life I've heard Trotskyite, and you use the term Trotskyist.
Right.
Does that change, or what's different?
Both are used. I decided, I think largely for aesthetic purposes, to avoid Trotskyite, which sounds like, you got to call in Clark Pest Control or something. I don't know. Trotskyite just sounds a little funny to me. Trotskyist was used, and I decided to go with that and be consistent all the way through, except where I quoted people saying Trotskyite. Trotskyite sounds less neutral somehow to me than Trotskyist, so I decided to go with that.
So that started, 5 years ago, or when that word was a bit, Trotskyist?
Oh no, the word is as old as the Russian Revolution maybe. But really, when Trotsky is in exile, there's an American Trotskyite party, Trotskyist party. You see both, but the Trotskyite thing just grates on the ear to me, so I decided not to use that. Folks, thanks for coming out. See you all again. Thanks.
Bertrand Patinat is the author of The Big Show in Bolo Land, the American relief expedition to Soviet Russia in the famine of 1921. He's currently a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Find out more. Visit hoover.org.